Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to the Concord Museum. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here, and I appreciate everybody joining us tonight, both those of you who are in person here and many, many people who are online watching virtually. It's a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's forum, which is a conversation with Nina Zaneri, the Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and Dr. Robert Martello, Professor of the History of Science and Technology at Olin College. As we know, Paul Revere's legacy has been both elevated and obscured by his now famous ride 250 years ago on April 18th, 1775. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's dramatic poem replaced what actually happened with a much beloved romantic version. Tonight's conversation will certainly shed light on the legendary ride, the poem, and the man behind it. So Nina Zaneri has been the Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association in Boston, which owns and operates a historic complex that includes the Paul Revere House since 1986. She completed a multi-year expansion project and $4 million capital campaign from 2007 to 2016 that added a visitor center and made the historic site fully handicapped accessible. And it's a wonderful visit if you haven't been in a while. Ms. Zaneri has held leadership positions in several professional organizations, including Vice Chair of the American Alliance of Museums, President of the New England Museum Association, and American Association for State and Local History Council. She currently sits on the board of the Freedom Trail Foundation, Siemens Port and Aid Society, Harvard University Museum Studies Advisory Board, and is a Boston Green Ribbon Commission Cultural Organization Working Group team leader. She received her BA in History from Boston College and her MA in Anthropology and Museum Studies from Brown University. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Robert Martello, who's a professor of the History of Science and Technology at Olin College, a graduate of MIT's program in the History and Social Study of Science and Technology. He's the author of Midnight Ride, Industrial Dawn, Paul Revere and the Growth of American Enterprise, a study of Revere's multifaceted career and national impacts. He's now researching Benjamin Franklin's printing and business endeavors, and he regularly lectures on Revere and Franklin, our founding makers, for audience of all ages and backgrounds. His NSF-sponsored research, engineering education, publications, and faculty development workshops explore connections between interdisciplinary education, student motivation, and self-directed project-based learning. He implements his findings in experimental courses such as The Stuff of History, 6 Microbes That Changed the World, Chemistry in Context, and Designing the 21st Century Engineer, and is a member of the National Academy Studies Committee on the Integration of Education in STEM, Humanities, and Arts. So I want to extend a very special thank you also to Claire and Joshua Nelson for their support of the museum's forums for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, as well as the Sally Lanigan Fund for generously endowing our forum series. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, along with Allison Schilling, our Deputy Director and Director of Programs. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa. I had the pleasure of first getting to know Nina in the fall of 2019 and then early 2020 when we hosted the exhibit Beyond Midnight that was organized by the American Antiquarian Society and we had here at the museum. We had planned a forum to coincide with that exhibit. I think we scheduled it for March 2020. If you can imagine, that didn't happen. And Nina was very gracious and rolled with learning virtual programming, and we had our first virtual forum with Nina. And still today, we have people watching online virtually. I'm sure many of whom were here for the first one. I really enjoyed preparing for the forum tonight and revisiting Paul Revere after the few years away. It seemed like a prudent time to bring back Paul Revere into the conversation. As Lisa mentioned, we're marking the 250th anniversary of Revere's famous Midnight Ride. Many of the stories we're telling for the anniversary are around some of the lesser-known people involved in the revolution. You would not initially think that Revere would fall into that category as probably the most famous person from April 18th. But because of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, Revere has become so mythologized through the countless recitations by school children learning American history. Tonight we have three pillars guiding our conversation: the man, myth, and legacy. And I hope we come away at the end with a more comprehensive image of this revolutionary hero. So thank you both for being here. Let's start, I would say, with our pillar of the man. So Revere's primary vocation, which we picture when we think of Copley's portrait of him, is him as a silversmith. So how did Revere come to become a silversmith? What was his career like in that space?
Well, I'll start.
Thank you.
As a good young man, he apprenticed with his father, who had come here and studied with John Coney. And so even though he was French, he learned in the English style, and he taught Paul as an apprentice to be a silversmith. Paul's father died early, and so Paul was not quite old enough to take over the shop on his own. So we understand that his mother probably ran the shop for a little while until Paul could run it. And so Paul's silver really reflects more English style. There's not really much in it that is French in nature. It's of the English background. And I think one of the, we have this issue of the lone rider, and there's also the mythology of the lone silversmith, the sort of Paul tapping away by himself in a corner, no one else, when in fact a silver shop would be full of people. His own sons who he was training, other apprentices, his brother who was also in the shop. And so, the lone rider mythology breaks down just as the lone silversmith does. In fact, people are sometimes horrified when we'll say, well, a piece of silver with a Revere mark may not have actually been made or handled by Paul himself. It may have been engraved by him, or it may have been overseen by him, but his mark would only go on if he felt it was of enough of a quality to be marked with his name. So he was overseeing it, but not all by himself.
That was, well, you didn't leave me that much. That was a great shot. Wow. I feel like I was boxed out of that answer.
Come on, Rob.
Well, I could try and fill in a few details. His father's name was Apollos Revere, which I find is always fun. And there's a letter from Paul Revere to one of his cousins in France saying, my father's name was Apollos Revere, but my father changed his name to Paul Revere. And the quote is along the lines of, so the bumpkins here could pronounce it properly. Right? So the idea, so technically the Paul Revere we're talking about is Paul Revere Jr., right? Technically speaking, although I usually keep the name Apollos Revere when I'm describing it. Also, it's a beautiful name, and it sort of helps distinguish the two and all that. And it's a lovely thought, right? That he was literally following in his father's footsteps, right? Learning the trade from his father, as did many artisans of this time. That was a common practice. The oldest son would usually take over the family business and work at the father's side. At some point, the father retired. The oldest son would inherit the shop. And so this is a theme we might get to later in the conversation about like what Paul Revere did with his own sons and the limits of like getting into your own field in this time. Buying your equipment, buying your property, that was a major limitation. So having family members in the field was such an advantage to do so. And one last thing I'll just mention. So you did a great job describing the collective nature of the work. That was extremely important. Paul Revere, if one word that I would use to describe him, he was versatile as a craftsman. He basically, if anybody walked into a shop and said, Mr. Revere, do you know how to, he would probably interrupt them right there and say, yes, right? And then say, now, what am I making for you, right? He would not want to let a sale leave the shop. So he would figure out how to make all sorts of things. He worked on over 90 different types of silver objects throughout his career. That's pretty impressive. From the common sort of like the bread and butter type things, lots of buckles and, silverware, right? Literal silverware. And if he was lucky and the patron had a little bit more money, wanted larger things, a tea set or a coffee pot, something bigger like that. But also bespoke items, very customized items. He once made an ashtray with silver legs being put on an ostrich shell that someone brought him. And another one was a beautiful silver chain for someone's pet squirrel. Right, so just to show, like, he was very much experimenting, and we're going to see that as the hallmark of his later career.
And one of the battles we have internally is, should we call him a goldsmith or a silversmith? He would say, my father was a goldsmith, I learned the trade of him, so goldsmith is a higher order. But for people, it's just easier to talk about him as a silversmith because people understand that connection. Yes. Although he certainly worked in gold and in silver, and his father made some beautiful items. Some of the few items that remain from his father. One is a very small set of gold cufflinks or cuff buttons. And they're made from a square piece of gold, bent around perfectly to be round. So the skill involved is amazing.
Yeah, there was a lot of that reusing of materials too. People would often bring their old silver to Revere and say, I'm kind of tired of this piece, I'd like to make a new one. Or even circulating silver coins, right? They had a very different view of currency back then. Than we like, imagine, like, I wouldn't take out a fistful of quarters, right, and say, hey, make this into something, right? That would seem weird. Back then, that was just as good a source of silver as anything. So customers would come in, provide as much of their own silver as they could, and then purchase the rest from Paul Revere. And in a time of limited materials, he would love it when you brought him some materials. That would make his job easier procuring the rest.
All right, so I definitely want to get back to Revere and his family and the shop. But I'd like to place them in the North End at the Revere House. So Nina, can you tell us a bit about the Revere House? And it was turned into a historic home before the poem came out and before he became really famous, right?
Well, the Revere House was built in 1680. There was a first owner who was a wealthy merchant by the name of Robert Howard, and then it passes through some other folks. And the Reveres buy it in 1770 and own it until 1800. They were perhaps out of the house for some periods of time. Revere never had his shop in the house. It's very disappointing to visitors, but I'm sorry, it wasn't in the house. His shop moved around the city of Boston. He was in a number of different rented locations. He seemed to be following where his customers were, but he was certainly in the house in the 1770s, and he was in the house in the 1790s. We often kid that because the house was an old house and the cooking fireplace was in the basement, that when they moved back into the house or came back in the 1790s, Rachel said, Paul, if we're going back to that darn house on North Square, I'm not going into the basement anymore. I want a kitchen on the first floor. And so in the 1795, around that time, they put a cooking fireplace on that first floor. So I think Rachel got her wish. They sold the house in 1800, passed through a number of hands. Some of the property was sold off and other properties built behind it. That's where our visitor center is. And then the house fell into, became a tenement apartments. And then right around 1901, there was a fire in the basement of the Revere House, small fire put out. My favorite headline is, Son of Dante, his lantern was unwisely hung. Think about that. Son of Dante, well, perhaps an Italian. His lantern, a nice play on lantern. This one was unwisely hung because of the Italian who hung it. Anyway, that made people think maybe we should restore the house. So the house was purchased by a Revere descendant in 1902. They raised money, the association was created, and it opened as a museum in 1908. So it's been a museum for quite some time. I haven't been there quite that long, but almost. Now Rob, no.
So you kind of alluded to his children being involved at the shop, and then his wife, Rachel, you've now mentioned. He had two wives at different times and kids involved in the shop. What was their experience?
Very much. It was a bustling house and a bustling business and all that. So as he was an apprentice to his father, Paul Revere brought his sons into his business. Before the war, so before the Revolutionary War, this business in its entirety was silver working. So like the story changes later, but at that point, the sons that he was having were coming in as apprentices. He would find other apprentices as well, and he would teach them the trade. And again, later that would change. The women in the house were also helping with bookkeeping, with buying and selling small merchandise. Right? There was always, all of these shops often had a little bit of a merchant sale, like maybe that's the shopkeeping, right, going on the side, right, for other types of goods. But again, keeping the books was very important for this. You mentioned that his mother, right, was helping at the very beginning, right, when Paul Revere was not technically graduated as an apprentice yet. For that first year, it was sort of a polite fiction, right? Just saying the house will be run, the silver shop, would be run by Paul Revere's mother because he was only 19 at that time. The truth of the matter is he was the one who knew the skills. He was basically creating the goods and doing the work, but we needed some kind of, legal cover, right, to make it look as if an apprentice is not running a shop, which would be illegal at the time. And you can imagine that, to me, that says something about the town there. This was probably a pretty shallow fiction at the time. People could say, how is this, wife of a deceased craftsman know how to run a silver shop and make silver? That's not happening. But no one would do that. They understand the family lost their patriarch. They're in trouble. They don't want that. So it was sort of allowed to proceed until he would have graduated as an apprentice, and then he was able to take over. I'm trying to think what else was going on. He was very good, like I said, at bringing family into the shop and helping make his connections, right, and make sales and do business items like that. That really helped the business side of his operations thrive. I mean, one more little detail I'll just sneak in. I can keep talking about that. I'm trying to let you get to your later questions. But Revere was a very early proponent of double entry bookkeeping. So having a credit side and a debit side where he could at any point figure out, what am I owed, right? What materials do I have on hand? What are they worth? And occasionally he'll tally them up and to figure out, how am I doing right now, right? Am I, do I need to start chasing down some of these debtors, right? Or do I have how's my stock doing? Do I need to be purchasing things? So very much balancing accounts, in different, sort of like a day book where he was just, recording sales as he made them. And then he would transfer those into a ledger based on the customer. So say you bought this from me on this date, then later date you bought more, then you bought more, you made a first payment here, you gave me this good at this later date, you paid me in service. So he's trying to take all of these different barter transactions and kind of tally them up. So I just thought I would throw that in there, right? Just to give a little sense of what's happening in the shop at this time.
Yeah. So this, I guess, will be my transitional question from the silversmith to the midnight rider. But Rob, something I read that you had written that struck me was that Revere's business benefited from Revere's service in the Revolution, his association with this colonial resistance. So could you talk a little bit about, or both of you talk about Revere's role with the Sons of Liberty and the St. Andrew's Masonic Lodge?
Oh, goodness, yes. It's amazing. It's a two-way relationship between Revere's business life and his patriotic endeavors. So he managed to make them each support the other, right? So he was a very active patriot, right? He was active from the beginning of the resistance movement, joining several of these organizations. As a silversmith, he was in a perfect position in society to play a role like this. We were mentioning before, you could imagine there's a bunch of laborers in society. The small farmers might go into this category. People doing what we would now call unskilled labor, right? That was a large productive base of the society. Above that in the hierarchy would be the artisans. And artisans had their own hierarchy of trades based on how much skill was needed to work on each trade and how much material was needed to do it. So silversmith was near the top of the artisan hierarchy. So artisans in general are sort of the productive middle class. And within that, something like a candle maker, like Benjamin Franklin's father, would be near the bottom, right? There's not a lot of expensive equipment, not as much skill needed, right, to make candles or soap, right? Silver, you need a lot of skill to work on that. The capital is expensive, the equipment is expensive. So that was sort of like a more rarefied trade, right? And so that was seen as higher up. And then above that group of artisans, you would have the upper class, the gentlemen or the gentry, as they were called, people who were sort of seen as beyond manual labor, people who were working with their minds. The lawyers, right, of society. The merchants in New England were sort of the leads of that. In the South, this would be the large landowners, the plantation owners. So that was sort of seen as people who were above the need to practice a trade for a living and were seen as more intellectual. So Revere was in the middle of this hierarchy, right? So that kind of meant he was seen as of the working class, but yet at the top of the working class with respectable skills, right? That were seen as very highly practiced, right? Using his judgment. So in other words, he was seen as one of the working men by his own kind, right? They would say like, yeah, Revere, he's one of us. He's a worker, right? The lodge members, right, would very much, right, lean upon him and say, okay, this is one of our people. He speaks with our voice. Then the upper classes might say, look, we need some representatives, right, to help us mobilize a larger group of the population. Well, Revere, I bought silver from him, right? He's a very responsible man. His work is excellent. It's highly regarded. So was able to interact across these societal levels. He was able to convert fellow members of these groups, right, of his lodge, right, of his resistance groups like the Sons of Liberty. He converted about 20% of them into his customers. So like while they're doing business, like, by the way, that buckle's looking a little old here. I could sell you one, right? And his customers, we have reason to believe he kind of helped move them towards the Patriot organization too, right? Or at least was able to use his status in the community as a reason why the Patriot leaders might trust him with some responsibility, like being a courier. Let me give Nina, do you want to fill in a little bit for me?
Two things. One thing is, again, the sort of lone craftsman. We've taken care of that for you. Now, no, that doesn't work. He's also using these networks on rides and both to become the rider. We talk about the ride. Well, it's not the only ride he made. He made rides throughout 1774. He was the trusted express. He was the person who was going to go to Philadelphia or New York and Portsmouth, so all kinds of things. So, of course, he's chosen as one of the riders on the April 18th night. So there's that piece of Revere as a convener, as someone who brings people together, who's using those. But he's also using them, again, for his business purposes. The other thing is that there are times when being a silversmith is not working well economically because of the tensions and various things happening, boycotts on tea, not making full tea services. So Revere will do whatever he needs to, and he uses his skills to do a lot of different things. He dabbles in dentistry. Well, that seems odd. Well, if you can stretch gold wire, you can take a tooth, wherever you happen to find it, and wire that in. And what do we use to polish our silver? Pumice. What do we use to polish our teeth? Pumice. Sounds delicious, doesn't it? But he's being able to take these things and merge them together. He can engrave on silver, so he can do the reverse on copper plates and do copper plate engraving. He has a very fascinating mind, and he seems to love metals. And if he can do something with gold or silver, and then eventually he's going to move on to copper and brass and other things. So for a person who had a very limited education, he was a really smart and creative guy.
Oh, for sure. Yes, I remember one of his advertisements for his dentistry work would describe, he would say, I could affix teeth, right, to fill a gap. They will serve the purposes of appearance and speaking, but not of eating. Yeah. Right, so I just thought that was interesting, just so we understand what we're talking about here.
Right.
Yes, and also the courier service you're mentioning to other cities, right? That would take a long time for him to travel down there. He was not simply, right, handing a letter, waiting for a response, and taking it back. He would be asked to interpret what he was carrying. Sort of like he would deliver the news from one correspondence committee to another one in a different city, and they would ask him to sort of elaborate. Can you expand upon this? Is this really, what's your opinion of this or that? So very much he's convening, he's interpreting, he's using his mind, right, and not simply being a good horseman, a good navigator of the roads. So just to make sure we understand what he's achieving.
And John Adams says when he goes to Philadelphia, Mr. Revere will give you the news. He's basically saying he's the guy. He's whatever he tells you is what we want you. So he's got that level of trust. And I will say that the one thing that he doesn't always stay at that level. He has a real problem. We can talk about that later.
Yeah. Happy to. So you've alluded a bit to like these different rides that he went on, this network of riders. It's a coincidence, but today is the anniversary of William Dawes's death. So in the spirit of thinking about these other riders, seems like a suitable time to talk about Dawes and these other riders. So can you talk a bit about this network of riders that participated in April 18th, but also in times before that and after that as well?
Well, certainly, I think the thing that we always think about is that the plan to get the word out about troop movements was too important for it to be in the hands of one person. So even though you have this trusted guy, Revere, who gets everything done, there was a lot of potential that Revere wouldn't get out of Boston, that Dawes might not get out of Boston. The lantern signals actually were received in Charlestown, and a rider was dispatched from Charlestown, never made it anywhere, perhaps was captured. And then the word would move out and out and out, and captains would pass things on to other militia members. So spreading the word wasn't contingent on one person being able to get where they needed to go that night. It was too important for the message to get out there. And Revere isn't the one who doesn't mention the other riders. He has 3 accounts that he leaves behind, and he mentions Prescott, and he mentions Dawes, he mentions Colonel Conant, he mentions that a rider goes out from Charlestown. So Longfellow, who we love dearly. I mean, the Revere House is famously popular, and we get a lot of visitors. Thank you, Mr. Longfellow. Doesn't cost me a nickel. He's out there doing PR for me. But what he did was he needed a lone hero. So he strips everyone else away, and he gives you the lone hero, and the lone hero is Paul Revere. Every once in a while, someone will say to me, well, you're from the Revere House. Why don't you ever talk about Dawes? And, you know, as if somehow Paul Revere had left behind a note that we shouldn't talk about Dawes or Prescott or anyone else. Paul shared the credit. He knew that that was important and happening that night. So we love all the riders who were out that night, and we know that they all had their role to play, and it worked pretty well. It worked the way it was supposed to.
I like the way you mentioned the different approaches, right? Because Boston at this time was a peninsula. We have to picture, you know, one way in or out called the Neck, right? There's like one sort of like road leading out. And Revere and the Patriots, and you know, Dr. Joseph Warren, right, and others were saying, right, you know, this is an easy peninsula for the British Redcoats to lock down. We need multiple avenues. We need like sort of plan A, plan B, and plan C to get the word out. It's too important to trust. That's what you were mentioning, Nina. So it was like Paul Revere will ride a boat, right? You know, will ride a small rowboat across, you know, basically the Charles River to the Charlestown side. Dawes will attempt to exit, you know, down the main road, right, down the road going down the Boston Neck, where unfortunately there was a British guard post exactly for that reason, right, to stop people from getting the word out. And if neither of these succeed, there was also, you see, like there was measure and countermeasure, right? So we'll try to get a horseman out on the road, but there's a garrison trying to block that. We'll try and get a boat across, right, the water to Charlestown, but there's a warship, you know, in the harbor, and the boats have been confiscated on the Boston side of things. If both of those fail, we have one more way to do this, light, right? You know, we could put lanterns up, right? They cannot block that. They can take the lanterns down, which they did, right? You know, people were spotting lanterns and pulling it. But if we have a watcher on the other side, you know, we might be able to get that signal across. And all 3 were received, right? You know, all 3 at least made it, right? You know, to the opposite side. So it's a nice, like, sort of a study of this, right? You know, how they achieved this.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's not, I feel like sometimes when people come to us and say, what about Dawes? It's like a gotcha, like, we were trying to trick you and think it was only Revere. But I think it even emphasizes the importance of Revere's role, that he was really central to this very important network of riders in this complex system that you're talking about. Yes. I would also say that like this, there being all these other riders in no way diminishes that Revere was putting himself in mortal peril over and over again on the night of April 18th. Like, what were some of the maybe highlights of his ride on the 18th?
Well, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about, because we're going to do, certainly in April 18th, we're going to do programming around the ride. You have Rachel. She is Paul's second wife. She has inherited the children from his first wife who passed away. She has probably, I think it's 5 or 6 children and a babe in arms. And Paul is going out that night. And so she is watching him go out the front door of their house. And she doesn't know. She doesn't know if she's going to see him again, when she's going to see him again. And I feel that. I feel that sense of how much Rachel participated in Revere's work by supporting and keeping the home fires going while he rode off, and it had to be difficult for her. He is, in fact, almost stopped one time. Two British soldiers are there. They come up at him. They get sort of bogged down in some marshy land, and Revere turns and goes a different direction. He certainly, after he talks to Hancock and Adams. He and Dawes decide to go on. They join up with Prescott, and then they will be stopped by British patrols. And when they're stopped, that time, Prescott and Dawes get away by various means, and Revere is held. And a gun is put to his head several times. And, the officers are going to blow your brains out if you don't tell me what I need to know. And Revere is, says who he is. He identifies himself. They know who he is. He does fib a little. He says there'll be 500 out. That's a little more than actually were on the green. But, he got a little lie in there with a gun to his head. But, he is actually at risk on that evening. And eventually his horse is taken and he walks back. But at any time during that moment, he could have been killed. He could have been injured. And Rachel's at home, and then somehow news, I'm sure, comes back about a battle, and she probably hasn't heard from Paul yet. So, you think about that playing out in any number of homes throughout that whole number of days, and it's just a reminder of how dangerous, and we know how it ended. They didn't.
You picked the event I would have called attention to when he basically had a two-part mission, right? Arriving at Lexington to warn the two Patriot leaders to get out of town, right? The army is on the march. If they find you, you will be arrested. So leave, right? And then go to Concord from there, and then warn about the munitions, right, that are at risk there. So he succeeded at mission 1, right, and he did not personally make it to mission 2, although Dr. Prescott did, and all that. And when he was dismounted, right, and held at gunpoint, and they said, what are you doing? It was a patrol of, I want to say 8. Does that sound familiar? Right, 8 British, so there's 9, right? So thank you, right? So a group of them, right, were basically saying that he was somewhat concerned at that point, right, that the people he just warned, right, the Patriot leaders he just said get out of town, might also be caught, right, by this patrol. So by bluffing, right, by saying, well, there's 500, right, of the Patriots right near here. They'll be here, soon in moments. I thought I read one account that said that there was the sound of discharging weapons. Yep. So that's like adding to this image, right, of saying, by the way, you who just captured me, you might about to be captured too. I've been warning people all evening, right? They're on the march. He was sort of trying to clear the patrol out of here. He was also trying to get away, but he was saying, let's get this patrol off the road just in case Hancock and Adams come like trotting down the road here, on their way, to safety, and we don't want them to happen there. So that was some pretty cool thinking under duress, right? And then he makes it back, back to Lexington, where almost comically Hancock and Adams are still slowly getting ready, right? And he's like saying, what do I have to do to get you out of here? It's like, please, I was just captured. This is bad. Please leave now, right? And finally they start exiting. So that was a lot of work, right, in that first evening.
Mm-hmm. So outside of Revere's role as an alarm rider, he'd made other contributions to the Revolution. At the Concord Museum, we have one of his Bloody Massacre prints in its original frame. Can you tell us a little bit more about Revere's contributions to the Revolution outside of the Midnight Ride?
I'll let you start.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, right? That one historian, Esther Forbes, called Revere the handyman of the Revolution, right? Just it seems as if when the Patriots really needed something technical done, he would be one of the people they went to. He would be high on their list. And so engraving was one of them. He was doing a lot of engraving as a silversmith. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts asked him, right, so yes, he was engraving propaganda, right, very important, get the Patriot side of thing out. He'd been doing that actually during the whole resistance period. But during the wartime, he was engraving promissory notes, I should say, for the Commonwealth. So almost like IOUs, in effect, that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts could use to pay its debts. And these were important. One of them actually used the copper plate from the copper plate that was used for the Bloody Massacre engraving. He then flipped it over, right, and then engraved some currency notes on that. So it just shows copper is something you are reusing your materials here, right? Mm-hmm. This is important. But lots of others. He would print those off. He was working on engraving them, on printing them. They would be confiscated by authorities so that no one would steal these and print off their own notes of currency. But that was important for the financing. He was asked at different points to set up a gunpowder mill, right, in Massachusetts, and to help a Frenchman, a different expert, work on casting cannons in Massachusetts. So these are other tests where they look to Revere, the metal worker, the technically minded person, to try and figure out how to operate new industries, right? They were not new in the world, not new in America, but new in this location, right? And being asked to produce, important materials of war quickly. He was usually at the forefront of those.
And lest we make him sound too perfect, although it is in my contract that I have to do. He was a mediocre soldier. And in fact, he was gravely disappointed. He thought he would be in the Continental Line. I mean, he's Paul Revere. He's the Express. He's the guy. Doesn't happen. Train of artillery, okay, that's not bad. But his most of the expeditions he went on, the one he went to Newport was a failure. He was in charge of the Castle Island, and there was really not much going on. There were a lot of deserters. There were things didn't go very well. There were sort of questions about leadership. And then he's involved in Penobscot, which is the worst naval disaster of the American Revolution. It's a very ugly affair. You've got 3 different commands. None of them want to talk to each other. Saltonstall doesn't want to bring his privateers up because he doesn't want to lose his boats, and Lovell doesn't want to do the ground troops, and Revere's got the cannons, and they're just not talking to one another, and everything goes to heck. And Revere comes out of that charged with cowardice and insubordination. And he comes back, and there's a lot of sniping in the newspaper between different officers. And Revere spends a good deal of time asking for a court-martial because he wants to be exonerated. And eventually he is. What I find wonderfully ironic is that Peleg Wadsworth, who was one of the commanders who Revere did not get along with, happens to be the grandfather of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So did Peleg take little Henry on his knee and say, "Oh, Henry, I done that Paul Revere so wrong. Could you do a poem and make him famous?" What a delicious irony. But mediocre soldier, just not his strong suit.
That's right.
So he does, after this disappointing military career, he does have a redemption story. Rob, something you wrote, you said Revere had ridden in one revolution and was contributing to the second one, the Industrial Revolution. So can you tell us about his career kind of after his military service? And
Now we're getting warmed up, Nina, right? This is the exciting part of the story. And actually, part of it starts with where you left us off, Nina, right? Because Revere, he was a very sharp person, very skilled, and he was aware of this. He was not modest or humble. He believed he deserved to stand amongst the ranks of the Patriot leaders, and especially during and mostly after the Revolution. He was saying, we had a revolution, a big upheaval in society. I was a major player, right, and my side is victorious at the end. We are creating a new world order here in America. I believe it's my turn to stand with the leaders. I feel like I've earned that. I've demonstrated my competence. One avenue that would have helped him, potentially, would have helped him rise in the ranks of society would have been a military career, right? So had that worked well and he received like a very high, military office, that perhaps could have been parlayed into some social standing. That was doomed, right? That, with all of the infamy, the charges, right? The long period of finally a court-martial that exonerated him. Although, wasn't there even a little bit of ambiguity in one of the things? But so it wasn't. So basically, that door slammed shut. Right. He then attempted to become a merchant. I mentioned merchants sat at the top of the social hierarchy. He was not able to do that. It was a poor economic time in general for merchants. His name was not known by other merchants, so they would not extend him credit. So he had to pay in cash, whereas others could run up accounts with one another, so that's no way to run a business. He just was not very good at being a merchant, right? He just didn't have experience there. That would have helped him get into the upper classes. He even tried to receive some appointments, right? He petitioned to become a customs officer, to become the first director of the Federal Mint, the National Mint, which would have made sense, actually, for a silversmith. He didn't have the name recognition, right, to be appointed to any of this. Time and time again, one road after another doesn't work. So he returns to his shop, not happy about it. This is not a triumphant craftsmen returning there. He wishes he didn't have to, but he returns there. And he then started a bunch of endeavors, right, that sort of, in a wonderful sort of like narrative way, end up making him very important to his country in a different way than he anticipated. So it starts with silversmith. He returned to his silver shop and very shrewdly, right, said, I could really increase my output if I could mechanize the first and most basic step of silver working, turning bars of silver into sheets of silver. Right? Sounds like a very simple process. It was the precursor to all the important silver work that would happen. All of the engraving, all of the forming and the cutting of different parts depended upon a uniform sheet. And you started with silver bars, or you started with random pieces of silver that you would melt into a bar shape and then have to make into a sheet. So he was saying, if we could just quickly make sheets instead of having all of my skilled craftsmen constantly hammering and polishing and measuring the uniform thickness, if we could just quickly do this, boy, that would increase our output. And so he imported from England a flatting mill, which is basically a rolling mill that could roll silver into sheets in a uniform way, much faster. Apprentices could operate this, right? Very much led to increases in profits and output. Again, shrewdly, he said, this is wonderful, but as Nina was saying before, silver working depends upon people having money to buy a luxury good. And he said, this market is not unlimited. I don't want to just, be dependent upon this. What else can I sell the people of Boston? In times when they're happy with the silver they have or don't have enough money to afford silver. So he built a casting furnace so that he could purchase bars of iron and cast them into utilitarian shapes. Things like window weights, pieces of fireplaces, just sheets of iron to go behind your fireplace to protect the brickwork from the heat of that. Right? So all sorts of large tools. He was now making utilitarian iron, which was much cheaper than silver, and people had a huge demand for it. He then went through a series of it, and I'm allowed to talk a little more, right? I realize I'm taking up my time. I'm looking to my friend Nina here, right? She's watching the clock. She's like, okay, I'll give him another 30 seconds, right? But to move through one job after another, he then is saying, okay, I have a furnace now. I'm working on my silver shop is still running under the able guidance of my oldest son, Paul Jr., his oldest son, Paul. I'm now working on iron goods. That's wonderful. New market opened up, making some money off of that. What else could I do with my furnace? He got a little lucky at this point. He was one of the elders of his church, and his church's bell cracked. Right, and the elder said, okay, well, this is unfortunate. The bell broke. We need a new bell. Let's take up a collection we could send to England, as people do, and get a new bell. He said, I bet I could figure out how to do that. I could use my casting furnace on a different metal. Instead of iron, use bronze. And instead of making utilitarian objects, make a bell. I think I could learn that. This was quite bold of him, right? Making a bell was much more complicated, much more artistic, right, than doing the things he was doing before with iron. His first bell, sadly, by all accounts, was shrill, right? It was not his best work, but he figured it out, right? And before we know it, he was now making large numbers of bells for churches, for schools, for ships, right? Bells of different sizes. This was I could describe it as an audible calling card for his business, right? Boston was a religious town. You could hear many different bells. And if you recognized one, you might be like, oh, wow, that's beautiful. Who made that one? And you might figure out, oh, Paul Revere made that. Boy, he seems like he's very good. Bells, by the way, were used for all sorts of purposes. They were used to summon people to church. They were used for fires. They were used to toll when someone passed away. Right? In fact, some bells on the inside had the inscription, right, to the church I summon all. To the church I summon all, and to the, wait a minute, no, now I've messed up my quote, right?
Something to the grave.
And to the grave I summon all. That's the second part, yeah. To the church I do call, and to the grave I summon all, right? I believe that's it.
That's why we work together.
I bring them, I was like, I'm messing up. Oh, I used all too early, right? And so very high profile. From there he moved into casting cannon, right? Same metal as bells, right? Bronze, right? Very close to the same alloy of metals, in fact. Same rough weight, around up to 2,000 pounds or so for the largest bell and for the largest cannon. So in the ballpark, still a different type of mold. There was a learning curve once again. So we're seeing Paul Revere demonstrating this versatility later in his career as his sons are backing him up. Right? So it's very interesting how he's reversing the usual trend where you might have an artisan working in one trade and their son saying, Dad, we should try this new field. And the father says, no, son, no, we're good at this. Let's stay with what we're good at. In this case, the dad is the one moving on to each new field, while he says, son, you do the old business. You, son number one, work on the silver shop. I would like to keep making profits from silver. Son number 2, Joseph Warren Revere, named after the patriot Joseph Warren, his dear friend, where he said, you take over the iron casting. I would like to figure out how to make bells. So he and his son, Joseph Warren Revere, are now working on different skills, while his first son, Paul Jr., is running the silver shop and making a lot of good things there. So he is enjoying making cannons, selling to the Army and the Navy. He enjoys this because not only is it lucrative, these are deep-pocketed governmental organizations. They will keep purchasing new armaments. Also, it's patriotic again. He's helping his country. He's writing. He enjoys this status. He gets to go to the naval yard and talk with people about what's needed and feel like he's helping. So he says, this is great. While he's there, he frequently is saying, what else might you need? I can fill other needs. What other goods do you need? The next leap he makes was one sort of like technologically simpler than what he was doing before. Bolts, spikes, other copper fastening devices used in huge numbers on ships, right? You know, ships had a tremendous hunger for this type of product. So he and his workers started turning out large numbers of these. And the last product he made was one that no other American knew how to make. He rolled copper into sheets to protect the outside hull of a wooden vessel from things like barnacles or even worse, shipworms, right? That would basically turn the hull of a ship into Swiss cheese, you know, and require costly refittings of hulls of ships. They would have to be dry docked and worked on for months to repair the hull. The British Navy figured out if you make copper into very thin, malleable sheets, copper is toxic to organisms like that. So like a barnacle or a shipworm would die if it attempted to attach to copper. They had to be replaced less frequently and quicker than the hull. So the problem was no American knew how to make sheets malleable like that. Revere had been making silver sheets for a long time. He understood the process of making a sheet in a malleable way, just not with the copper metal, but with silver. So he said confidently to the Secretary of the Navy, I can figure that out. If you give me a loan, I could do it. And long story short, he succeeded in 1801 at age 65, becoming the first American to roll copper into sheets. He repaid his loan relatively quickly by making such big sales back to the government because they had a big need for this. And this was in the years before the War of 1812, when the supplier of these sheets, Great Britain, was not on the best terms with America and all this. So I could stop. There's other goods there that I could do that, but that's the main trajectory, right, showing this great innovation. Nina, you've probably been dying to fill in something here, right? You've got a good...
Just one
good
thing,
angle.
that through all of this, Revere continues to have a chip on his shoulder. He never really recovers from any slight. The not in the Continental Army, the not the director of the Mint, the not a Harvard graduate. And so throughout his business dealings, there are moments where he's kind of prickly. One of the bells he made, the people accuse him of it not having a good sound. And he says, well, if you wanted it to be a sweet sound, you should have told me and I would have made it that way, but you didn't, so I didn't, so it's your fault. So he's a little prickly. He's in a relationship with Robert Fulton, and he's supplying sheet copper for boilers. And he and Fulton have an exchange where Fulton says, Revere, your copper's not very good or something to that effect. And Revere says, your workmen aren't very good. So he's always proving himself. He's always trying to get to that. And there is a moment later on when he's in Canton and he writes a poem about the Canton property. And in some ways it's a poem where he's finally at peace. You get the sense where he's finally decided that he has become the man he wanted to be and that he has that peace. That's and he's right. In Canton and he's, his son Joseph Warren a mill is pumping away and he's out there in his country estate or how he visions it. And it's the first time where I sort of feel like he's said, finally. But he carries that, and it's very interesting. It creates this prickly nature in him that's kind of endearing, actually, but is always there.
Yes, wonderful.
So we know that Nina loves Longfellow for the free PR. We sometimes grumble about him because we spend a lot of time busting his myths. But when Longfellow wrote the poem, he wrote it with this very important anti-slavery message. So could you talk a bit about this legacy of Paul Revere as the inspiration, as this abolitionist figure for for Longfellow?
I mean, it is a push and pull, and it's a matter. It's what happens. It's what we should all do. Is we need to look at things within the context of their times, and so we're talking about Longfellow in 1860, and he's looking for a way to encourage people to think about the country, to think about the value of a human. Each person has a role to play. Each person can make a difference. The poem is full of a lot of allusions to various things. Certainly, the end of the poem, in this hour of darkness and need, we are on the sort of verge of civil war. Jill Lepore and a lot of people have done great sort of examinations of each verse of that and how that really reflects. And another irony is that Paul Revere has 3 grandsons who fight in the Civil War. 2, Paul Joseph and Edward H.R., both die in the Civil War. Edward H.R. at Antietam, he's a surgeon, he's on the field attending to someone and is killed. Sadly, his brother, Paul Joseph, they were the Harvard Regiment. Paul checks on his brother before he leaves to go home. He's been wounded. And he writes later to his mother, "I left him well on the field, not knowing that his brother had been killed at Antietam." Paul Joseph goes back and he dies at Gettysburg. And I often wonder, did they read the poem? Did they hear the poem? Did these 2 young men who go off, who say, their mother begs them not to go, and they say, "I must go, it's my duty, I have to do this," and so they go off and die, as many people did. But we don't know. We don't know if they ever heard the poem and said, "That's a poem about our grandfather. This also makes it more important for us to go," or was it not on their radar at all? I don't know. We don't know that piece. But certainly the effect of Longfellow writing what clearly was a wonderful and dramatic piece of that time, he wasn't writing the history of the event. He was writing a dramatic piece about an event that people understood. His poem is wonderfully dramatic. What actually happened that evening, the actual facts, are equally dramatic and interesting. So it's not one is bad and one is good. It's created this imagery that people have stuck in their heads because most of the illustrations of the ride are taken from the poem. Although I will tell you, and one of my board members is going to cheer now from the virtual world, we do have a new book coming out that is Paul Revere's words used to narrate what will be new illustrations of the ride. So we're going to try to do something that will give people new imagery that will replace some of the imagery in Longfellow's poem, but not replace Longfellow, because I need those people coming in the house.
Okay, do you want to leave time for a couple of questions from the audience? Raise your hand. We'll just get you the microphone if you hold on a second. Thank you, Deborah. There's a couple people over there.
I'm just interested in this abolitionist aspect of the Longfellow poem. I'm not familiar with it at all. I feel ignorant. Could you say just a little bit more about that?
Well, Longfellow was an abolitionist. And so again, what he's trying to do is create imagery that will help people want to participate in the Civil War. It's a rallying cry for the Civil War. There are other allusions in it that I can't speak to, but if you're interested, Jill Lepore has done wonderful work on sort of dissecting the imagery of the poem and sort of placing it in its context and making more connections to that than I can. But she's done a really great job of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
I wanted to ask you a question about Prescott. I was unaware of the sort of network you're talking about of writers. The urban myth here is that he was in bundling with his fiancée and just happened to get asked to come out to Concord with Revere. Was he actually part of that network of riders that was already in existence, passing messages for the resistance, if you will?
My understanding is that he was not per se. He was returning home to Concord. He comes upon Dawes and Prescott, and Dawes and Revere, and they identify each other, and they claim him as the son of liberty.
Yes.
And so that means he's trusted. He's headed to Concord. He knows the people in Concord, and so he agrees to take Revere and Dawes along.
And he knows the roads.
And
right,
the roads as well. So it makes perfect sense. So they sort of agree, well, that makes sense, because now we've got a local who can help us get on our way. I don't believe that he was intended to be part of that by some prior arrangement. It just happened. But he also is credited with not just coming to Concord, but also continuing on, is my understanding, that he went on to Acton and Stowe and continued to pass the word. So he gets the fever of what's important to do, and he gets brought into the process. That would be my understanding.
Right, that's mine as well.
I don't think I need it.
It's for the people watching online.
yes,
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you.
I have a very simple question. Where are Paul Revere's account books?
Paul Revere's account books
You mentioned
are,
them.
are located at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so they have been digitized at this point, right? So there's different ways of accessing them, but the originals are there as well. And I remember when I was a graduate student, I was doing my research there and looking at the microfilm and the digital versions and wishing I could get my hands on those originals, right? And once, there was one rare time when I was looking at a record and I said, oh, this isn't very clear. And they said, well, Rob, we'll have to go to the original. I said, yes. got to take the gloves on and look at the book. But they're all there. Something like 56 or 57 volumes of them. So quite a lot of records.
And how did they find their way there?
How did they find their way there? Do you know the family donated? I would imagine. Right?
Most of the records that survive, or a good number of them, were in family hands. In fact, when Goss wrote his biography of Revere in, I'm going to say, 1890s, he was still dealing with John Revere, and a lot of the footnote says, John has the letter or whatever. So they were still in family hands. The family was very smart about making sure that things went where they would be kept in the best way. I mean, we often wish that some of the silver had come to the Revere House, but quite frankly, in 1908 or then in 1934, when Pauline Revere Thayer dies and leaves her large collection to the MFA, that was the right place. The Revere House was not the right place for a ton of silver at that time, and the MHS was the perfect place for those documents at that time. Again, we would have loved to have been able to take a few out of one of the bags or something, but they really did go to the right places.
Take one last
Is
question.
there any documentation that Paul Revere's bells or copper is in the USS Constitution?
So that would be his copper, right? And
Yeah.
it's so close to being documented, but not quite. I remember we talked about this with some of the researchers at the Paul Revere House. He was selling copper sheets to the naval yards at this time when it was being coppered. They also had some other sheets present, and they coppered the ship. So it seems highly likely, right, that his made it on. But it was a little bit it was sort of like there's flows coming in, and there's, so like we can't like exactly pin it to that ship, but close.
They like to make the case that the magazine of the Constitution is Paul Revere copper.
It's probably,
Yeah.
they're probably right. It seems very reasonable that that's correct. I'm just saying, like, the historian in me is saying, I can't give you 100% on that one, but it seems extremely likely that at least some made it on there, and probably a lot. Probably most.
Well, in one of the recopperings that was done, not the last one, but the one before, the copper was supplied by the Revere Copper Company that still exists. And our board president at the time, who was a Paul Revere, he and I got to go under the ship, and he got to actually put his name on a sheet and pound it up on the bottom of the ship. So there has been some Revere copper on the bottom. We know that, at least one, that made it there.
We'll take one last question.
I've already had one, so it's a short one.
I wonder if history is repeating itself because Boston was a center of resistance during a time of Paul Revere. It was before before the Civil War, and now the feds are coming again for our undocumented and our documented workers. And it was in the Globe where they said, I'm going to Boston, I'm going to give them hell. So my question is, do you think that maybe history repeats itself?
Well, I think every generation, I think, has its Paul Revere. I will leave it to that. There may well be a Paul Revere, and he gets identified. I know there was a moment where Greta Thunberg was called out as a modern day Paul Revere. So that people still make those connections. I suspect there will be one.
Yes, that's a good one. That's a good one.
I think that's a good place to close. Thank you so much, Nina and Rob.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.